So today I want to say a few things about discussing antinatalism. It seems to me that the first and most fundamental rule of any type of advocacy or activism is to explain the position being presented. And this might seem fairly obvious, yet it's surprising how often activists at least seem to neglect this point. So, for example, many or most of you, I imagine, are familiar with the meat is murder campaigns. Now, when these campaigns use this phrase, meat is murder, what they're implying by it is that the production of meat involves not merely killing, because of course people know already that it involves killing, but that it involves wrongful killing. But then this is really the same as simply saying killing other animals is wrong. And this is to state the position, not to explain it. Now, in fairness, I do think these sorts of campaigns do have an effect, and no doubt many campaigns of this kind are far more substantial than what I just described. But in any case, I think it's important that whenever we present a position, we attempt to defend it, substantiate it in some way, particularly when there are very strong arguments available. So Schopenhauer suggests the following on how we might effectively do this in a more private discussion. State the premises first, then the conclusion. I think this is as fundamental as it is effective because very often when our discussion is framed in terms of is antinatalism justified or not, that is, anytime the conclusion, in this case antinatalism, is brought up in the discussion before the arguments in favor of it, any points that are raised in favor of the position are going to be seen largely in relation to the conclusion. Again, in this case, antinatalism. And so, if people are opposed to antinatalism to begin with, they're less likely, I think, to accept points which they might actually concede if presented independently. And so the way that I often introduce people to the subject of antinatalism is by asking them this question, and it's a question found in Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion, namely, would you want to relive the past 20 years of your life in its entirety exactly as it was the first time? To which people almost invariably say no. And why do I keep going back to this question? I ask people this question because I think most people base their optimism about life on the quality or perceived quality of their own life. In other words, I think people think, I know, or I think, or I believe life is good because my life has been good. And so this question or thought experiment can undercut people's foundation for optimism in a very direct way, I think. And if we go further, adding, if necessary, the point about the relative intensities of pain and pleasure and other asymmetries, we can often get people to admit that life isn't nearly as good as we usually or like to imagine. And they will often come to see that the world as a whole contains more bad than good. Indeed, they'll see that the world is something better not to have come into existence at all. And in fact, if you ask people whether they would have created this world, if they could also perfectly foresee what sort of evils were in store for it, most of the time they'll say no, or be very reluctant to say yes. And to this extent, many people, I think, are pessimists about the world. But the reason that we can sometimes get people to concede this much, I think, is because these points are not seen at this stage in relation to any normative claim. In other words, to any claim about what one ought to do. Because it seems to me as soon as a thing becomes about right and wrong, in other words, about one's character, it becomes personal. And many people are not eager to talk about or examine this aspect of their life. And so Schopenhauer is basically telling us, don't reveal where the premises lead until the conclusion can logically be derived. Now, of course, even if one succeeds or manages to present a perfectly sound argument and the interlocutor has admitted all the necessary premises, this still does not ensure, of course, that they will accept the conclusion. But speaking generally, I would say that effective arguments are those which have premises which are almost universal. That is to say, you want the premises to be easy to accept. You want them to be statements or propositions which your interlocutor already, to some extent, believes or would believe if they considered the matter. Now, one other thing about discussing antinatalism is that since many people do reject pessimism and almost do so categorically, it is, I think, helpful to have a few arguments for not reproducing that are compatible with a certain degree of optimism. And so these might be arguments about adoption, environmental concerns, perhaps arguments about consent, and other issues that can be logically separated from a pessimistic worldview. This is not unlike the way scientists will often try to get the teaching of evolution into school curriculums, right? Belief in God and Scripture, they say, is compatible with evolutionary theory. And that's more or less what we're saying here. Antinatalism, or at least a qualified antinatalism, is compatible with a certain degree of optimism. And so this I find helpful as well. So that is all for now, and thanks again for listening.